There's an ancient prophetic text which sets up something which I believe has been carrying on for literally thousands of years, and it's this. And it's actually from the book of Genesis, first book found in the Torah. You've got the God of the Bible, Adam and Eve, and you got the serpent. And the God of the Bible basically states something which is profound. And he says this, your seed, talking to the serpent, will be at war, at enmity with the seed of the woman. He will crush your head, you will bruise his heel. There's a prophetic narrative there, because the he that's talking about becomes Messiah. The seed of the woman eventually becomes Messiah. But the seed of the serpent, and this is what's so crucial about this passage, in my opinion, the seed of a serpent, 3 chapters later in Genesis 6, erupts. And what we read is something that's profoundly disturbing. We hear that the sons of God, and in the Hebrew that's B'nai Ha-Elohim, most of your Coast followers know this, but for the the newcomers, it's always good to go back. The sons of God are the fallen angels, and they see the women, and they desire them, and they take wives from whomever they want to. They take these women, and the offspring is a hybrid being, part angelic, part human, which probably means, and I'm reading into the scripture here, that they have superhuman powers on some level.
Well, that tells me, number one, that they, the Nephilim, are physical beings. Mm-hmm. They aren't spiritual by any means, are they?
No, but they may have supernatural powers that mere mortals do not have. What's interesting is, apparently, one of the side effects was giantism. And they were men of renown. And what's interesting also is it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. And, of course, last time we were on with Richard Shaw, we were talking about, our Watchers 10 movie, and it's also in the book, but the whole Afghan giant thing, which Steve Quayle broke right here on Coast to Coast. And that was astounding because we talked to the shooter, and then a third witness. So you've got Steve Quayle's pilot, who comes on the record, and you interviewed him on Coast. It's a riveting interview. Then you've got our shooter, which is one of the guys that shot this thing. And he says the thing was about 12 feet, absolutely humongous, 6 fingers, 6 toes, flaming red hair. He moved with an agility and speed that just defied him. I mean, he just looked at it and went, how can this guy move that quickly? But he did. And he impaled one of the soldiers, and they brought him down by shooting him. And there's probably 12 to 15 guys in this platoon.
Where did the Nephilim come from? I mean, these aren't cases of angels coming from heaven. To me, it sounds like they're coming from a planetary system out there.
Well, and that's up for grabs, isn't it? Look, anything that's not from this planet is extraterrestrial. So if I say an angelic being, call it what you will, is an extraterrestrial, now people can say, oh my gosh, but in essence, that's exactly what it is. Anything off-world is an extraterrestrial, even if something that is off-world is interdimensional. And I believe what's happening is that these entities, wherever they're from, are interdimensional. There's a whole, and I'm sure you know about this, there's a whole talk being bandied around on the internet that we live in a holographic universe.
Right.
I mean, if that's the case, then it's like, where are we really, and what is this really? And does that mean that that there's nothing else out there? And I don't know. But I mean, if we're in a holographic universe, then all bets are off. But it does explain some interesting facts. It explains the fact that when these so-called angelic beings come, they have the uncanny ability to manipulate space, time, and matter and energy in ways that human beings cannot do it. And so it appears like it's magic to us, but they just do it because it's who they are. It's what they can do. It's what they come in with. But they manipulate space, time, matter, and energy. And we read about this. We hear about this. So I lean to the interdimensional hypotheses rather than the extraterrestrial ones. We know that we're being visited. We know something is going on. There's a breeding program going on within the UFO community. Hybrids are being created. The Nephilim were real. They were on the Earth. The ancient structures that are all over the planet, from Gaza to Peru to Machu Picchu. I mean, wherever you want to go. I mean, this is, in my opinion, you can't duplicate these things today. You can't. Even with the modern technology that we have, you can't build a wall like what we see in Sacsayhuaman.
Isn't it amazing how when you read Genesis and just try to equate it to a real-life event, it echoes it almost perfectly?
I agree. I mean, I'm right there with you.
Talk about the Lovelock cave handprint. What is that, L.A.?
Really fascinating story. The backstory on this is a friend of mine, Ron Moorhead, and he was called to a cave by another researcher. Now, the Lovelock cave is in Lovelock, Nevada, and it was originally the site of the Paiute Indian tribe, First Nation people, Native Americans. I actually spoke with a Paiute Native American elder about the cave, one-on-one, which is incredible. I said, can you tell me about the cave? And she's telling me this oral tradition, which has been handed down through the centuries. She talked about these large, very tall, very strong, red-headed giants that lived in the area. And what is now in front of the cave, it's a dry lake bed, but you go back 1,000 years and there was water there. It was very lush and very verdant. The cave has been sealed off by the BLM. And originally, the cave went way back into the hillside. We'll never know how far back it really went because it's all sealed off. So when you go there, there's really not much to see. There's just a cave. The legend that was told to me was this. The tribe finally got tired of having been raided by these giants. They had a war party, and they warred against the giants. And they basically gave them an ultimatum. Stop doing this, get right, or we're going to wipe you out. And, of course, the giants wouldn't do that. They retreated to what is now known as the Lovelock Cave, and they went deep into the cave. Interesting, it's always a cave, just like the Afghan giants.
Yeah.
And so the Paiutes took all this brush and put it in the mouth of the cave and piled it and piled it and piled it. And then they set it on fire. And as some of the giants would run out, they were shot. Interestingly enough, in the dry lake bed around the 20s and the 30s, 1920, 1930, I believe a 12-footer skeleton was found of a male and a 10-foot female. Very, very tall. And, of course, all that's hushed up. We have no idea where the remains might have been. Again, the BLM has gone in there and they sealed the cave off. Before they did that, archaeologists did go in, and I've got a book actually from the 20s, which is really interesting because it's you got to kind of read between the lines. In that book, it doesn't talk about very large skeletons, but in one of the accounts, it talks about finding some 7-footers, which again isn't that large. It's not like the 9-footers I found out on Catalina, but it's pretty big. So fast forward to modernity, and when you go to the Lovelock Cave, there are no electric lights. There's no tour guide. It's just a cave, and it's essentially the mouth of a cave because they sealed off both tunnels that would go deep into the mountain. Those are completely sealed off. So there's really nothing to see. There's a wooden platform there, and you look up above, and the ceiling is all blackened, perhaps from a fire, which ties back into the oral tradition. And these guys were exploring around the walls of the cave, and one of the guys found this giant, what appeared to be a giant handprint on the wall. Well, these guys took pictures of this thing. They sent it to me, and I made a beeline out there, but I arrived about 30 days after the fact. So we get to the site. We're all excited. We hike up this trail. There's no one around. And you can, by the way, when you're in the mouth of the cave, you can see for miles, literally. It's an amazing vantage point. Strategically, it would be a great place to defend and hole up, which is what, according to the Paiute tradition, the giants did. So we get there. We're all excited. The cameras are rolling, and we're moving around to the place where the handprint supposedly was. That picture of the handprint, and there's this gentleman holding a knife to give you an idea, like a Bowie knife, how big this handprint is. I mean, it's really large, about 2 to 3 times the size of mine. And it's there, and he posted it on Facebook, mistake number 1. So by the time we got there, and again, this is in the back recess of what is now the last remains of the cave, and you really got to be looking for it. There's no lights. You got to have flashlights, and you got to be looking for this thing. So we get there, and Ron and Joe are freaked out because they can't find it. And one of them basically say, look, this is the rock. I know this is the rock. This is the place. It's not there. George, someone had come in and either chipped it off, washed it off with acid. The bottom line was it was completely obliterated. There wasn't a trace of it, nothing at all.
Do you think it was vandalized?
No, I don't think it was vandal at all. I think it
suppression.
Was, I think it was very deliberate by the powers that be. Of course, that's where I'm going to fall to because that's what Having been out in Catalina and seeing everything else that they do, that's the way the game is played. And they didn't want this out there. The mistake these guys did was posting it on Facebook, and somehow it alerted the BLM or the powers that be. And I mean, when we went to the Rock, there was nothing there. I mean, why would a vandal do that? I mean, if you were a vandal, why not go there and take a bunch of pictures and post them on your Facebook page? Wasn't done. And this is in a really remote area. I mean, it's hard to get to. It's on a dirt road, and you've got to hike up to the cave, and then you've got to know where it is. Even with flashlights, it would be hard to find, and these guys discovered it. When we got there, completely obliterated. So what's interesting to me is that hand ties back into the Native American oral tradition. Is it conclusive? Of course it's not. But it's another step in the direction of verifying the Native American oral tradition that there were giants, very, very large people with 6 fingers and red hair that weren't part of the indigenous population, that were there and doing unspeakable things. And what I find interesting ties right into the ancient book of Enoch, which was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's a definite connection between the two. It's not conclusive, but some of the DNA evidence I think that we uncover in the book and also in the film Watchers 10 points to that Middle Eastern European origin, and that's not supposed to be there.
Tell me about the ghost wolf.
There's a clip that's at a Native American reservation in the Southwest. I spent time with this person and looked at the original footage off the game trail, the original footage, and watched it before and afterwards. And this woman who took it, you know, she's Navajo and born and raised on that reservation. And she set up game trails in these areas because people were reporting strange things happening, going on at night. And so the whole purpose of the game trail being there was because there was something's going on, so she sets up the game trails to see if it's, you know, what's happening here. She calls it a ghost wolf. It kind of looks like a wolf, but you see a pickup truck, and this thing appears from nowhere. It's like a gateway, an opening, a doorway to another dimension opens up, and this thing that kind of looks like a wolf, but it's really, you know, I mean, that's what she's calling it. It's some sort of, in my opinion, a demonic manifestation. It jumps over the truck, hits the ground, and then it, in just a few bounds or whatever, it just leaps into the air and then disappears. And, you know, I've watched this thing frame by frame by frame. My good friend and the co-producer of the Watchers series, who's, you know, Mr. Photoshop himself, Richard Shaw, when he examined it and he thought it was the real deal. It's just a very, very short clip. It goes in and out of the frame. And remember, the game trail is putting a frame up like every, well, you can set it for one every 3 seconds, a frame every second. I mean, you know, you can set the game trail like that, and that's how that works. What's interesting is on this reservation, there's all sorts of occult activity. I mean, all sorts of occult activity, and it's ongoing. Everything from multiple Bigfoot sightings to UFO sightings to very strange chimeras being sighted. It's all over the map.
Let's talk a little bit about skinwalkers. Skinwalkers, of course, a person who has got the ability to flip and turn into, shapeshift into an animal, for example. You've come across some of that in the book. Not
personally, and frankly, I don't want to, for the obvious reasons. But I spoke to a man who had 2 encounters with it, and he has to remain anonymous. But I interviewed him, and he comes in on the record. That interview is verbatim in the book, Nephilim Hybrids. And look, I'm not calling a skinwalker a Nephilim hybrid. That's just a generic term I'm using because we're not sure exactly what we're looking at. But it all links back to the dark side. That's the point. And I remember speaking to one gentleman who was being trained to become a skinwalker. And in order to attain the power, you have to kill a family member. He came on the record and told me this. So here's the first of the 2 stories that this guy told me. He grew up on the reservation, Navajo reservation. And he and a bunch of buddies, like 3 or 4 guys, are walking in this one place. And he actually took me to the place. And it's sort of rolling hills with chaparral, cactus. It's semi-desert. I mean, it's the desert. And as they're walking, it's getting around dusk. And they hear this piercing scream coming from the other side of this small hill. So these guys run up to the top of the hill, And what meets their eye and is coming up towards them just completely freaks them out. Now, these guys grew up on the reservation, so they knew about skinwalkers. But this was the first time that this guy had ever seen anything like this. It had the body of a man, the thighs of a man, but from the knees down, the legs of a wolf, and from the neck up. And it wasn't a mask, George. It wasn't a mask. From the neck up, it was a wolf's head, basically what we would call a werewolf. And, of course, they were absolutely terrified. And they ran like crazy, and this thing chased them and followed them. And they got to this house and slammed the door, and this thing was like scratching and pounding on the door. And then some weird stuff happened, and the thing went away. That's the first encounter. The second encounter is, to me, incredible, and it shows, a person that's schooled in spiritual warfare knows how to handle stuff like this. And this guy's father was a pastor, was a Native American who became a pastor, became a Christian, then became a pastor. And there was a skinwalker that was terrorizing this one family, and there were death threats on this family. So one night, now the kid's about 21, and he's at home with his father. The phone rings, and it's this family, and they're freaked out because the skinwalker is on the property, and they've seen it, and it's coming to kill them. That's what it's there to do. And so this pastor, without any hesitation, George, he grabs his Bible and goes, "Let's go!" And they get in the pickup truck, he and his son, and they drive over to the house. And this guy is not timid. He jumps out of the car and goes, "Where is it?" and goes running at it. And he's yelling at the top of his lungs, "In the name of Jesus." I mean, it's something right out of some novel someplace or some, religious film. But the bottom line was this thing retreated. And talking to the son, who at that time was 21, told me that they chased it into the brush, and it moved again so quickly and with such agility that it would move from like one place to the other place, and it was difficult to find. But they got it into this one place, and then it just sort of vanished. It just went away. And they saw the prints around the house. They saw the wolf prints around the house. So it was interesting to me, and look, I'm not trying to sound religious here, but this guy dealt with this stuff. He dealt with it one-on-one, and that power in that name chased the thing out, and that not his authority, but the authority of someone greater.
With all these things you've looked at, L.A., what does this tell you about what's happening here?
I think that the veil that separates the unseen supernatural dimension from the natural world that we live in is getting very, very thin. I remember a few shows ago we were talking about black-eyed kids. We interviewed people like David Weberly, who was just
an expert on that.
Incredible researcher. But we sat down with a woman, Leah Campen, who came on the record. She had an encounter with this thing, and these black-eyed kids are real. I'm going to guess I get at least one a month, an email from first-person account where someone has an encounter with it. There was a woman that just wrote me recently. Her husband, who is no longer with her and passed away several years ago, she watched his eyes go completely black. Something's going on. I think things are shifting. Things are happening.
What was it that got you interested in this entire field?
Well, there was a book. This goes back to the late 80s, early 90s. And I had some questions about certain passages, specifically in the Bible, which really bothered me, and I just couldn't reconcile them. And I would get to these passages and kind of go, "Ooh, we'll skip over these pages, thank you very much," or I would read it and just sit there and just wonder. And even studying some commentaries on some of these passages about this race of beings known as the Nephilim. And I was at a bookstore, and the woman pointed me to this book, and this book literally changed my life, and it's called The Omega Conspiracy by Dr. I.D.E. Thomas. And I remember reading the book and then going, oh my gosh, and rereading the book, and then rereading the book, and taking some of the footnotes and going back into his footnotes and his bibliography and looking at his sources and getting those books, for instance, the Book of Enoch. When I got the Book of Enoch, which is a pseudepigraphical book, big fancy word means that it was attributed to Enoch, written by someone else, but the Book of Enoch is quoted 70 times in the Old Testament or the Tanakh, alluded to several times in the New Testament. It's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Historians quote it. Josephus references it, and Dr. Thomas used that book to support his idea and his exploration about the Nephilim. And it was, I mean, it's the place to start. It could be said that I cut my teeth on the Omega conspiracy. That book changed my life, set me on the course that I've been on ever since. From reading Dr. Thomas's book, the Nephilim trilogy came out of that.
And who are the Watchers?
The Watchers are a class of angelic beings known as the Watcher Angels. Some of them are good. Some of them are highly malevolent, or so it appears. And the backstory to this is there's a war in an unseen dimension, all right, in what I would consider the third heaven. There are three heavens. We're told in ancient texts, specifically Judeo-Christian Bible. The first heaven is earth. Second heaven is the atmosphere above the earth and into the universe, and who knows how far that goes. The third heaven is outside time-space as we know it, where the God of the Hebrews and the God of the Christians dwell, okay, supposedly. And that's the paradigm that I hold on to. So the Watcher Angels come from there. But some of these Watcher Angels, specifically according to the book of Enoch, 200 of them descended on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared. The progeny is the Nephilim. But then later on we hear, and specifically in other passages, a Watcher came from heaven, specifically with Nebuchadnezzar, which is just bizarre. So Watcher seems to be a class of angels, and we use that, but it's a double entendre, meaning that we're the Watchers. We are out here looking at what's going on and reporting back. There's other passages that actually get into detail. For instance, Goliath was a Nephilim. Ishbi-Benob was a Nephilim, and on it goes. And we get different accounts of the Goliath's brothers and the giants, and six fingers are also talked about in those texts. Then we get extra-biblical texts like Josephus, the first-century historian, which talks about, and I'll just read you one of those quotes, which is absolutely incredible. This is what he says. For this reason, they removed their camp to Hebron, and when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. Now, but wait a minute. What is that? What inhabitants? And then he explains, there were till then left the race of giants who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day. So the account is not only biblical, but we've got extra-biblical sources that talk about these giants. But if there was a diaspora, in other words, when Joshua and Caleb were going in to the Promised Land 3,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, and my hypothesis, and this is why we're on the trail, I believe that there was a diaspora. In other words, the giants, these Nephilim tribes, saw what was going on, okay, and they fled the Levant. They fled the Promised Land. Some went northward into Europe and then literally came down into the Ohio Valley and settled out that way. That's what we believe. Others came, and look, Thor Heyerdahl, on his best-selling book Kon-Tiki and Ra, proved that so-called primitive people could build boats and sail out the Mediterranean and wind up in the Gulf of Mexico.
How tall were the giants, L.A.?
It really varies. We don't know. There's pre-flood giants because that's where the Nephilim starts. And that's what the whole flood of Noah is about. That's why the flood of Noah happens, because the Watcher Angels that you asked about earlier are on the earth, and they're there for it's not like a weekend incursion. They're there for 450, 500 years, whatever. And they've polluted and contaminated the gene pool. And there's only 8 people left. And that's where you get the whole Noah story. And that's why everything is wiped out in the flood. It's beyond science fiction at this point. It's so over the top, the mind reels, but the text says that Noah was pure in all his generations. And then there's a vetting process. The Most High God goes, Noah, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives all get on the ark. So 8 people, in my opinion, their genome is still intact. They're not contaminated with Watcher blood. And this is the reason for the flood. Pre-flood, these guys might have been 35 feet tall. We get some hints of that. There was one skeleton found in the last century, in the 20th century, that talked about a 30-footer found. Now, that's never been vetted, but it's there in the written record in the newspaper. After the flood, it goes way down. For instance, Og, king of Bashan, which is a biblical figure, one of the last of the giants, last of the Rephaim. In other words, there's all these different Nephilim tribes in this area known as the Levant, or modern-day Israel, or the Promised Land in antiquity. And Og might have been 15 feet tall. Goliath, 12 feet tall. So the hypothesis is this, George. If the biblical narrative is true, and our hypothesis is that there were many different Nephilim tribes, many of which had different genetic characteristics, some of them, for instance, called the long necks. Some of them may have been 9 or 10 feet. Some of them may have been, 7 or 8 feet. So if that's true, we should begin to see evidence of that in the Americas and elsewhere. We do find evidence. This is what we think. And it ties back into what the geneticist has talked about. So it's absolutely fascinating. It's the best job in the world, in a way.
And does your research seem to echo what Genesis writes about? Do you find Genesis to be accurate?
I absolutely do. It's interesting, and I'm going to go a little bit sort of a roundabout answer here. In a classic movie, which is now what I believe is a classic movie by Ben Stein, called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And he sits down with Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins, of course, is a premier evolutionist from the 20th and 21st century, one of the premier evolution. And Stein asks him, okay, where did the first self-replicating molecule come from? And Dawkins says, we don't know. And he's vexed. You can see Dawkins is upset by this line of questioning. And so Stein kind of throws him an intellectual lifeline and says, well, tell us how it could have happened. And this is all Dawkins can come up with. Now, remember, this is like an ardent evolutionist who is against any type of a Genesis creationist account, who says, well, it could have happened in this way. Maybe, a long time ago, millions of years ago, in another part of a galaxy or a galaxy far, far away. That's sort of tongue-in-cheek. I'm misquoting him, but that's what he's saying. A race of extraterrestrials would have risen to a very high level of sophistication by some sort of Darwinian process. And perhaps they created us and then seeded us through the galaxy, and we wound up here on planet Earth, and it was favorable to life, and presto changeo, here we are.
You had mentioned that, of course, the flood of Noah, and that we've always believed that it was set up by God to wipe out evil, to get rid of them. You believe that to be the case? To get rid of the Nephilim?
Well, that's exactly what it is. And we hear this 2,000-year-old prophecy saying it'll be like the days of Noah when I return, which points back to what the heck is going on with the days of Noah. What differentiates the days of Noah from any other time in history? And this is why it's so important to understand what actually happened in the days of Noah. George, I believe that we're involved in a cosmic war. I really do. And I'm not, some of the listeners might go, he's just talking religion. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a cosmic war between extremely powerful entities that interface with us from time to time, and that we're on the planet from time to time. And the whole idea of the flood happens because there's actually a promise way back in Genesis. And you can go back and read it for yourself. It says, your seed will be at enmity with her seed, and I will crush your head, you will bruise his heel. And you go, oh my gosh, what's that talking about? And of course, that gets into the whole prophecies of the Torah, which I believe some of them were later fulfilled in Yeshua. But we get this idea of a seed war that's going on, that happened back then, that happened in the days of Noah, and happened afterward, and I believe it ties into the present day, the modern day abduction phenomena. And of course, that's just astounding. So I look at the Genesis account, and it's so important to understand who the Nephilim were, who sired them, and then how that trickles down, or how that affects us literally today, right now in modernity.
Let's talk about this Navajo American elder.
Well, I was at a conference out in New Mexico, and I was on a Navajo Indian reservation with the conference, and the pastor of the church was showing me all around, and we went and we saw petroglyphs and one places that most people don't even know about. He actually told me some stories that just were very difficult to listen to and hard to believe about those who wear animal skins and become other entities. The common name for that is called a shapeshifter. And this man had literally encounters with them when he was 16 years old. And this is very common in and around that area. There are sightings of Bigfoot. There are sightings of basically what you would call a wolf man. There are UFO sightings all in this area. It's a hotbed of occult or paranormal activity. And what was interesting, as I was presenting, this woman came up to me and said, when I was a child, I used to hear stories from my grandmother. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, if you like, I can tell you about them. And so I went to her house. She was kind enough to open her doors, and I went there. She wouldn't let me photograph her, but I was able to capture the interview on audio. And she talks about this race of giants called Yaitza. That's the word, Yaitza.
Huh.
And this is in their oral tradition. And what I find so fascinating about this, it's not only in her oral tradition. In On the Trail of the Nephilim 1, there was an interview that we did with a past Pueblo Native American called Robert Mirabal. We discussed the giants. And he starts off, George, and this is what's incredible. This is all oral tradition. It's handed down from grandfather to grandson or father to son over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. In the wintertime, Native Americans, this is before the white man and even after the white man, but certainly pre-Columbian, would sit around the fire and they would tell these stories. This is the oral tradition handed down, and they were not embellished. I mean, they're not fish stories. They're not trying to tell the story better than the guy next to you. These were their part of their culture, and these stories were held sacred. And they talked about the giants. Robert Mirabal starts off with his giant story, and he says, and it's a long time ago that there were giants in the land. They came from the sky. And I'm looking at this going, you have got to be kidding me. And I called Robert, and he came in on the record in much the same way this woman, Navajo woman, did. Completely different tribe, although, it's in the general area of the Southwest, but separated by hundreds of miles, completely different tribe, different language. And he's basically got the same story that she does, slightly different. Then we go on the East Coast with the Cherokee, with the Iroquois, the same thing. The idea of this race of red-haired giants. The Paiute tribe. I sat down with a Paiute elder and spoke to her, and she said the same thing. This is all in their oral tradition, and unfortunately, up till recently, many archaeologists and anthropologists have dismissed these oral traditions because they're not written down. They're just handed down orally from one generation to the next. So they dismiss them. But frankly, I believe in Native American oral traditions, and now more anthropologists and more archaeologists are going back and listening, just sitting and listening.
There's no question that thousands and thousands of years ago, very strange things happened on this planet. But can you imagine human beings 30 feet tall?
Let's not even go 30. Just go 20-footers. What if you got a bunch of 20-footers running around? That's a game changer. And again, if there are 20-footers, then we should see some signs of that. We don't see signs of 20-footers, but we do see signs and I believe physical evidence and photographic evidence of 9-footers. And that's a big guy. It's not a 20-footer, but a 9-footer is certainly.
That's a big person.
That's a big guy. Absolutely.
What happened to them?
Well, again, back into the oral tradition, the tribes talk about these wars that they had, red-haired giants. I mean, and they annihilated these tribes.
They all got wiped out?
Wiped out.
What was the population like then? Was it 200?
I would say it's not in the thousands. And this goes back to our geneticists who, talk to about that they might not have been able to inbreed with the human population or found it very difficult to inbreed with the human population. And maybe this is why they finally died out or their numbers were so low.
How do we know that Sasquatch might not be one of these Nephilim?
That's a great question, George. And I've sat down with Ron Moorhead. We actually interviewed him for Watchers 8, which was just an incredible interview. And Ron sort of spilled his guts. He talked about being up in the Sierra Madres in the middle, and this site is in the middle of nowhere. He's interacted with these beings literally for decades. He's got a CD called Sierra Sounds where you actually hear the calls out in the wild in the middle of nowhere because they brought in recording equipment in the 90s. And this stuff has been tested at a major university in the Southwest, and there seems to be a language. He discovered 28-inch footprints, and the stride between the footprints, George, was over 15 feet up in the Sierras.
Jeez.
and they came on the trail they just appeared on the trail. He followed them, and then they just disappeared. And he has seen this with his own eyes. These beings, and I've heard this from other witnesses, whatever these guys are, they seem to be more interdimensional. They have the ability to come in and out of our space-time. And he's vetted that. He verified that for me. Other people that have had encounters said the same thing, that whatever these Sasquatch, Bigfoot are, they seem to have the ability to pop in and out. People have seen them materialize and then dematerialize, and that is, beyond anything in our scope of physics that we know about.
L.A., tell me about the Bergas femur.
The Bergas femur was found decades ago in a part of a coal mine, and this is a very robust femur. And I spoke to Bernard Ziffel, who's the curator of this museum in South Africa, and this conversation was recorded and went on, and we had a romp for about an hour. Basically, it's a very big guy, and it's a fossil bone, but it's a fossilized bone, and which would be outside a normal human being. We're looking at a 9-10 footer here, somewhere in that range. Very robust, very large, and he has no idea where it came from, and it perplexes him. He's not on board with the Nephilim like I am, but he looks at this artifact and he scratches his head like I do. It's like, wait a minute, are there more of these? And we don't know whether this is pre-flood or after flood, but it was found in a coal mine, very deep, I think 60 feet below the earth. So that begs the question, how the heck did it get there? And it's a great mystery. No one really knows if there were any other artifacts found with that. Sometimes with these dig sites, George, parts go missing, samples go missing.
Are they stolen?
Stolen. They're just taken and never seen again. They're bundled up. We hear reports of that over and over and over again. But I couldn't believe the interview with him. It was astounding. We're doing a Skype interview, and I go, well, where is it? And he goes, it's right here. And he reaches down on his desk and picks this thing up and holds it in front of the camera. So here I am looking at the Bergas femur. And it's not the whole femur bone. It's the upper part of the femur bone where the ball attaches to the pelvis. But it's very robust and very large and outside the range of a normal Homo sapien sapien, a modern Homo sapien sapien. So they don't know what it is at this point.
What does this tell you if all this has happened and these beings were indeed around? What does that tell you? What's the bottom line here?
Well, the bottom line for me is this points back to our hypothesis that there seems to be an outside agency that is manipulating, and this corresponds to what we read in the biblical narrative. It points back to the veracity of the biblical narrative, which I find just so incredible. Even ancient aliens, we're not that far apart. They know, like I do, that there's something else going on here. The evidence is overwhelming that somebody is outside the norms. There's some group, call them extraterrestrial, call them angelic beings. If you substitute the extraterrestrial hypothesis and just insert fallen angels or interdimensional beings, we're on the same page. Because you can go right down the list. Go to Sacsayhuaman, this huge megalithic structure, or the pyramids, or the ancient grid system that seems to be over the planet. Something is going on here that has been hidden, and I mean hidden, from most people. And now, because of the internet, George, and the age that we live in, we can exchange information. You couldn't do this 25 years ago. You couldn't, hit Bergas femur and bam, it comes up right on the internet, and you can look at it. Or Paragas skulls. Brian Forrester never could have taken the Paragas Museum with all those artifacts down there, but he had his camera, and he's doing all these selfies, and he's got his camera set up on a tripod, and he's does these little YouTube videos, and he puts them on, and thousands of people, and I'm one of them that saw it, and next thing I know, I'm on a plane with Richard Shaw, and we're going down there to film and check all this stuff out, all because of the time that we live in. So knowledge can be disseminated, and I find that absolutely fascinating. George, where does the knowledge come from to build the city in Corral? Corral is about 3-hour drive north of Lima. Where does that come from? And we see this pyramidal complex that is very, very similar to Teotihuacan, and I'm working on that now. I'm researching it. I've been to both sites. But Corral is the oldest city in the Americas. It's over 5,000 years old. And it arises, there's no culture that predates this. There's no, well, let's try to do a ziggurat. There's none of that. The whole complex just rises up.
It just shows up.
Floor, bam, and there it is.
There it is.
And then they're gone. They disappear. And I find that absolutely astounding. When
people investigate these areas, I mean, what do they try to conclude?
Well,
what can they conclude?
This is part of the problem. And this goes back, and I'll point back to Ben Stein's movie Expelled. Stein sits down with tenured archaeologists, anthropologists, biologists, many of them who've lost their job because they began to just hint at that maybe there's something else going on. They hinted at intelligent design. They didn't even say creationism, just intelligent design. There seems to be an outside agency that might be responsible for some of what we see. Darwinism, in the Darwinian paradigm, there is no supernatural. Everything is nuts and bolts, and here we are. And it happens over billions of years, and here we're just an accident. That's all we are. But Darwinism doesn't explain what we see in Sacsayhuaman. And archaeologists and anthropologists who go to Sacsayhuaman, I've been there, are absolutely astounded by what they see, these megalithic structures, some of these stones weighing 120 tons, and they're polygonal shapes, and they're quarried 40 to 50 miles away, and yet they're brought onto the site. We talked about this on the Trail of the Nephilim, Book 1, and some of the photographs are just astounding. And we see these polygonal shaped stones fitted together, and other researchers have been down there. Well, the archaeologist looks at that and scratches their head. They really have, if they're intellectually honest, George, they have no idea.
3,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, when Joshua and Caleb pressed the conquest of the Promised Land, they were these tribes of hybrid entities known as the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Emim, the Zanzumim, the Horites. They were all there in Milan. And what we think, this is conjecture, this is our hypothesis, when they began to go in and press this conquest, many of these tribes just packed up and fled. They just fled the area. And what we see, in my opinion, and this, of course, is in other films, is that there's traces of this. They moved west out through the Mediterranean, Cyprus, Sardinia, Sicily, Spain, Menga, into Portugal, up into the UK, and finally over here. And we show that in episode 4 and 5, America Stonehenge, where there's a definite connection to basically the Phoenicians, once again. And the Phoenicians are Canaanites. The Canaanites is a broad term for the Nephilim. So they're everywhere. It was utterly global. And we think they landed in Peru 3,500 years ago. And we have some startling information, which we did not put into the film, but I'll tell you basically, as the interview unfolds a little bit. My discovery out on Catalina Island when I found that photograph showing Ralph Glidden, 1919, primitive archaeologist employed by the Hay Museum, later gobbled up by the Smithsonian, front page of the LA Times when he actually discovered this stuff. I was on the island. I found the photograph. Glidden standing in front of a 9-footer. We had that photograph analyzed by 3 separate techs, all placed it just around 9 feet. Well, the museum redacted the photograph, redacted the giant out of the photograph. And until I discovered the photograph, it was just sitting in a museum archive box in a vault. And when I published it, it went viral. And the museum didn't like the results, and so they redacted the giant. They cut it out of the picture and blew up the photograph and wrote this hit piece on Ralph Glidden. Well, we photographed that, filmed that. That went viral. And, of course, now when you go to the museum, last time I was there, the photograph is there, but there's nothing about what you're looking at, folks, is a 9-footer. And that ties right into our whole idea of that the Nephilim were here in the Americas thousands of years ago.
Okay, and biblically speaking, the Nephilim were the offspring of human women and extraterrestrials that came here. Does that tell you then that these elongated skulls which you believe to be part of the offspring of the Nephilim, are humans born here, or did they also come from another planetary system?
Well, I don't think they're planetary, and you know where I stand on this. I think they're interdimensional. Basically,
right.
The Hebrew word is the B'nai Ha-Elohim, which refers to messengers, the angelic hosts of another dimension. So these entities came down, and we've got other books like the Book of Enoch, like the Book of Jasher, Book of Jubilees, that are not part of the biblical canon, which talk about this incursion of these entities which come down. Sitchin and that whole crowd, the Anunnaki. We're talking about the same thing here, in my opinion. So if you want to say it from another planet, you can say that. In my opinion, they're interdimensional. They're coming down, but they're doing the unthinkable. They're creating a hybrid entity known as the Nephilim. And this is heavily documented throughout the biblical narrative. And what's interesting, when you actually go to the Genesis 3:15 narrative, where it talks about the offspring of the dragon, the offspring of the serpent, will be at war and enmity with the offspring of the woman. He, the Messiah, will come and crush the dragon's head, which we know happens at Calvary 2,000 years ago. So, people can choose to believe that or not. That's a prophecy that's thousands of years old, and yet we see it fulfilled basically 2,000 years ago. And then the whole thing changes, George. The whole dynamic of the Nephilim and hybrids change, and I'm going to leapfrog here into the modern UFO phenomena, but that's where it goes to. It goes to the hybrids. The same type of thing is going on, but they're not given in marriage, which fulfills another prophecy, which talks about in those days, what days? The days where men will run to and fro over the face of the earth and knowledge will increase. And those days, they, who is the they? They will mingle their seed with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to them. And the word cleave is the same word given in marriage. There's no marriage contract like there was back in the Genesis account, at the time of Noah, and also afterwards when Joshua and Caleb are pushing that conquest into Canaan. I mean, it's all right there, and it's very enigmatic and it's very mysterious, but a careful student of the biblical narrative can sort it out. It's not completely cloaked, and I think we've done that.
Why don't we have elongated skull people running around the planet right now?
Because they seem to have vanished, at least most of them. Now, the Kandahar giant, that, in my opinion, was a Nephilim. And we talked about that in our Watchers 10 series with my good friend and the late director, Richard Shaw. We miss him very much. But, Rick and I did that film, and that went viral with the whole Kandahar giant. And hats off to Steve Quayle. Hats off to you for coming in on that and talking about it. It was just a wonderful interview. Our roles were reversed for that, but it was great.
Yeah.
And we broke that story with the Kandahar giant, which was different than Steve Quayle's account. In other words, there's two giants, and the one in Kandahar was about 12 feet, lived in a cave, and we don't know how extensive that cave complex was, nor do we know how old this entity, this giant, may have been. It could have been thousands of years old. We don't know. But the whole idea of a Nephilim just sort of go away. And that's why we're not seeing this down in Peru. Now, in our film, DNA, The Final Results, we show a man from the Mubeto tribe who has an artificially elongated skull. But there are morphological differences between the elongated skulls in Paracas and this man living in present day from the Mubeto tribe. I mean, there's definite, you can see the difference. And just some of these differences, and this is why we truly believe, and we state it in the film over and over again, these are anomalies. They are not the result of cranial deformation. They're not. And George, I got to tell you, I mean, I am after doing this for 7 years and looking at all the evidence, and this, you can't do this through pressure. You can't do this from cranial deformation, cradle headboarding. This is something that is genetic, and we can talk about some of those differences.
Now, you talked to an optometrist. Tell us about his remarkable discussion.
Well, he's looking at these, and we knew something was up with the orbits, where the eyeball is. We knew something was going on with that. And he's going, well, here's the first thing, that these orbits, these eye sockets, are about 30% larger than a normal human being. George, you can't do that through pressure.
No.
And what this means, what this translates, is that more than likely they were either nocturnal, lived in caves, lived underground. And when I was with Tim Alberino last May, 2019, and we were down in Paracas, we went out to this place. It's called a reserve. And we were there with a Peruvian archaeologist, and he took us to the remnants of the Paracas people. Some of these things still are there. Many of them were bulldozed down and completely destroyed, but there's several of them that are still sort of intact. And they're made of whalebone with seal skin on top of it, and on top of that, like a foot or two of mollusk shells, and then they go down into the earth. And I asked the archaeologist, I said, well, you know, when you guys went down and explored these things, did you find evidence of torchlight? How could they see? And he looked at me and said, no, there was no evidence of any of that. We don't know how they saw. Here's the kicker, George. One of the Nephilim tribes were called the Horites, and they were cave dwellers. The word Horite means cave dwellers. We also know that because of the foramen magnum, the placement of the foramen magnum, that's that hole in the back of the skull where your spinal column attaches, okay? And we know that that's pushed back. And you've got a picture on the coast-to-coast site which shows the what's called the Chongo skull. It's the one that most people see when they go on the internet and they type up elongated skulls. That will come up. It went viral. It's very elongated. And we were the only team up till recently who was able to take that skull out of the display case and have it turned over so we could see where the foramen magnum is. And it's the first time that anyone's seen this, as far as I know. That foramen magnum, if it's any further back to the posterior of the skull, it's outside the skull. You cannot do that with pressure. And right. You can hear me go, when she turns it over, I go, oh my gosh, it's all the way in the back. Because we knew what to look for because of the work of our anthropologist, Rick Woodward, who basically said the foramen, and other doctors corroborated his work, and surgeons, that the foramen magnum should be, you know, in this location, more in the center of the skull. But because it's placed all the way in the back, it would necessitate some sort of correction or an elongated neck. And here's, again, one of the Nephilim tribes, and I'm not making this stuff up, is called the Anakim. And Anakim is translated long necks. They're not giants,
wow.
But neither are the Paracas.
That also sounds like Anunnaki, doesn't it?
Exactly, very much. And that's why there's a similarity there. I think the mythos that we read, from Zechariah Sitchin's work and others, I think it mirrors the biblical narrative. So what are we really looking at here? Are they planetary or are they interdimensional? And we don't know. Truly believe that these are not human beings. They are another species.
Now, the Hebrew Bible talked a lot about the Nephilim, didn't it?
Well, it does. And this is what this, the whole thing with the Nephilim, everything hails back to Genesis 3:15. And this is what's so important to grasp, why they're here. And this was sort of the nexus of the entire book, Countermove, how the Nephilim returned after the flood. We know that they were here, but we know that something happens in Genesis 3:15. He has fallen angels go down on a mission. They land on Mount Hermon. That mountain is in Israel right now. I mean, you can go there and see it. It's called the Mountain of the Oath. And that whole idea is when these 200 watcher angels come down in the days of Jared, and they take wives. They take multiple wives, creating this hybrid being, part angelic, part eternal, with the human woman, which becomes the Nephilim. And
so they are earthbound, weren't they?
Well, yes, the Nephilim are earthbound, but the fallen angels are not.
They are not, obviously.
They are not.
And when God went to Noah and said, build the ark, do this, and create this flood, and I'm speaking biblically here.
Right.
When he did that, was it to eradicate the Nephilim?
Exactly. It's exactly what's going on. And this is why it's so imperative, unless we understand what's going on with Genesis 3:15. There's protocols in this ongoing heavenly war, which has been going on for millennia. We have no idea how far back it goes. The protocols are such that, God could blink his eyes and the whole thing could be over. But that's not what he does. So what he does, he allows it to play out. And that's why Genesis 3:15 is so incredible, because here's the prophetic mandate. Well, the dragon sees that, knows someone that's going to come and take his kingdom from him, crush his head, and so what does he try to do? He has one shot. Poison the seed, contaminate the seed of the woman so that won't happen. And he almost succeeds, except for the 8 people on the ark. Except for the 8 people. The corruption, George, it wasn't a weekend frat party with these guys. It was at least 400 to 600 years they were here, and they completely contaminated pretty much everything.
What did they want? What do they want with us?
Well, it's not what they want with us. They hate us. They want the planet. The dragon wants the planet. The dragon wants Earth. He wants the domain.
The dragon being Satan?
Exactly. And when Adam forfeited his right, he basically gave the title deed of Earth to the dragon. And so what we are engaged in is this war, which has continued literally for thousands of years. And I believe it's coming to a head even as we speak. The stuff that's going on now is absolutely incredible. So it's an ongoing war between the seed of the serpent, the dragon, and the seed of the woman. The one that will come from the woman will crush the dragon's head. That happened 2,000 years ago with the Messiah.
Not all of the Nephilim then died in the flood, obviously.
Yes. They were all drowned, and this is where this is why I wrote the book, because it's in Christian circles there's all this controversy about this. Well, how did they return if they're all dead? If the fallen angels didn't do it?
Yeah, if it was all gone, how'd they come back?
How did they come back? And this is what's incredible about this. I have read this chapter in the Book of Enoch for years. I mean, like over 30 years I've read this chapter.
And this is new. This is something you discovered, right?
Correct. But it was the Spirit of a living God who. Let me tell you the story, okay, real quick.
All right.
So I'm reading a book, and this guy has written a book about the Nephilim, and he's talking about that somehow one of the women, specifically Ham's wife, one of Noah's son's wives, got on the ark, and she was carrying a Nephilim gene. I never bought that. I still don't buy it. It's absurd. It makes God a trickster. Well, I'm going to kill everybody on the earth and drown them because they're all contaminated with Nephilim DNA on some level. But I'll let one sneak in on the ark. Not buying it. What we see in the Book of Enoch, it says this. And before I give you the punchline, so I'm laying in bed, and I'm kind of talking. I'm praying. I'm going. I can't read Hebrew. I'm not like a biblical scholar. And some people say, well, yes, you are. Okay, well, we can argue about that. But I can't read Hebrew. I can't read Greek. So who am I to really delve into this? And I know this might sound a little woo-woo, but this is the way it works. So Semyazi, this fallen angel, is on Mount Hermon with the 200 watcher angels. Now, this scripture has been in there for like 2,000 years. People have read it, but no one's ever looked at it like this. And Semyazi says this to the fallen angels: I fear that you will not agree to do this thing, and I alone shall have to bear the penalty of this great sin. Semyazi knows exactly what's going to happen, but he does it anyway because he's been promised that there's going to be a jailbreak, you're going to get out, we're going to get you out, this is how we win the war. And so it's a kamikaze mission. And when this happened, when I got that, I ran down, I told Peggy, my wife, and then I got on the phone, and it was in California. So it was 10 o'clock, roughly my time here in California. I called Gary Stearman. It's midnight there, and we talked for an hour on the phone about this. That's how revelatory it was. And what I realized was that suicide mission, they do it again and again and again and again and again until the cross, and then it goes away, and then it changes. And that's where it gets in the prophecy of Daniel, where their seed will mingle with the seed of men, but they will. It's all about the seed, right? Their seed will mingle with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to them. So who is the they? Their seed will mingle with the seed of men. It can't be men's seed, so it's a foreign seed. Once again, it goes back into the fallen angels. And this book was sealed up until the end times. It says specifically, Daniel, seal up the words of this book until the time of the end. Men will run to and fro over the face of the earth, and knowledge will increase. That's exactly where we are now. The book is open. People like me, Chuck Missler, others, look at this verse and go, oh my gosh, we're talking Nephilim. Their seed will mingle.
Interesting.
And in the book, Countermove, I take all the information that I just gave you, and of course it's expounded because it's a book. But towards the end of the book, I say, well, is this happening now? And it is. The prophecy of Daniel is screaming at us with the abduction phenomena, because that's exactly what happens. The seed is mingled, but there's no marriage.
Nobody has studied the Nephilim like you, L.A. Nobody. How many Nephilim do you think roam this planet now, L.A.?
Well, a lot of them are underground. For instance, the ones that are in Kandahar. And the alarming thing about that, George, we have no idea how old that thing was. I mean, the shooter that was there that came on the record anonymously, we have to, disguise his voice and pixelate his face. He said that the stench of that thing was like a pile of rotted corpses, which I've never smelled anything like that, but I got a hunch it smells really bad. The question is, was he 2,000 years old, 1,000, 3,000? We have no idea.
We don't know.
We don't know. But there's more. There's others of them. And what alarmed us, or what kind of blew us away, is we got together with Steve Quayle and we realized that Quayle's giant and our giant were two different giants, two different times, two different locations. So we know that there's more than one. Absolutely. And we have another witness who was in Kandahar province, and when he was doing cave fighting, get this is in the film, and we had to disguise his voice and everything else too, because these people were taking a risk coming on the record. He said when they were being trained to fight in the caves, the instructor goes, aim high. And they were going, what do you mean aim high? Just take my word for it, aim high. That's all he would say. Well, why are we aiming high when, I want to knock the guy in the chest and in the head, that type of thing. No, you want to aim high. That was the cave training. And so, the rest is history.
Do the Nephilim have our kind of technology? I mean, look how we've advanced technologically. Have they gotten that kind of technology? Or are they still living, as you said, in a cave, but are they living like cavemen?
I would say this, that what we're seeing, and Dr. David Jacobs wrote about this, walking amongst us, they can pass as human. These are the modern-day Nephilim, in my opinion, are the hybrid entities that people report having encounters with.
They're not giants?
They're not. No, they're not. And here's what's something interesting. Our work on the Paracas skulls, we went out. I was out with Tim Alberino, and we went out way out into the reserve with an archaeologist, Peruvian archaeologist, and he showed us where they lived. Well, they had taken whalebone and made this like arch, and then covered this arch way with seal skin, and then put mollusk shells on top of that. Thing must have stunk to high heaven. And then they burrowed down 20 or 30 feet. So they lived underground. They weren't giants. The Paracas skulls are not giants. And I'm looking at this going like, well, I asked the archaeologist, I said, well, did they find evidence of torchlight down there? He goes, no. I go, well, how did they see? So I took the skull, when I got back in the States, I took one of the replicas of a skull that Joe Taylor makes, and I went to an optometrist friend of mine, and I had him look at it. And immediately, and this is all in the film, one of the films that we did DNA, the final results, and he looks at it and he goes, well, first of all, the orbits, the eye sockets, are about 30% larger than a human's. Second, which is just incredible, the second factor is that the pupillary distance between the pupils should be about 65 millimeters. That's normal for a human being. These aren't. These are about 42 millimeter. I go, well, what does that mean? He goes, well, when you add all this together, larger eye sockets, the narrow pupillary distance, this thing probably had night vision and could see in the dark. I about fell over. He knew nothing about the cave, cave dwellers, nothing about the underground Paracas people. And so what I discovered was that one of the Nephilim tribes, get this, drum roll please, is called the Horites. And the Horites are cave dwellers. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were giants. Yes, one of the Nephilim tribes, the Anakim, was long necks. Some of them were giants. I get that. But what we're seeing is there seems to be different genetic traits for different tribes. The Horites were cave dwellers. They weren't giants. But these elongated skulls going back to Paracas, we know that the DNA points to a Middle Eastern or a European haplogroup, and that rewrites history. They shouldn't be there, George, but they're there. If hybrids are walking amongst us, and I believe that they are, I've talked to people who have had encounters with them. I don't want to have an encounter with them, but I've talked to people who have, and it's very, very unnerving. These entities are modern-day Nephilim, in my opinion. They are a mix of seed. They are a mixture of seed.
Do they know what they are?
Yeah, some of them
do.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that they do. But I haven't sat down and talked with one. I just, and I don't. I'm not sure I want to. But we'll see where it goes.
Have they infiltrated politics, governments, things like that?
Well, I mean that's a rabbit hole, and I can speculate on that. There's no way to know.
What was it, L.A., that first got you interested in the Nephilim?
It was Dr. I.D. Thomas's book. I mean, as a Christian, as an early Christian, this goes back 40 years now, 41 years, okay? So I'm reading the Bible for the first time. So, and I'm trying to sort all this stuff out. So I get to the flood of Noah, and I freak out. I go, what's this guy doing? I get to the Tower of Babel. I freak out again. Why is he doing this? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And you sit there and you go, this Old Testament God, he's nasty, he's vengeful, he's maniacal, he's capricious, and murderous. It's like, what's going on? Genocidal. And finally you get to the mandate when the children of Israel go and take the promised land, and it's wipe everything out, kill every man, woman, and child, burn all the animals, destroy everything. That was it. And I just, I knew about Jesus. I love Jesus. That was really cool. I got that. But I could never reconcile what I was reading in the Old Testament with what, with the New Testament with Jesus. It seemed like two different people. Entered Dr. I.D.E. Thomas's book, The Omega Conspiracy, changed my life. And when you factor in the Nephilim, everything I just said changes completely. The flood happens because it's move, counter move, counter move. The flood is a counter move by the Most High God to wipe out the Nephilim. The Tower of Babel is when it starts to come back in again with Nimrod, which is just absolutely incredible. And there are ties to Nimrod and Gilgamesh. This is why it goes back in the whole Anunnaki thing. They could be the same entities that we're talking about. So there is a connection, in my opinion, between Nimrod and Gilgamesh. He becomes a Nephilim. He becomes a Gibor. From Babel, it gets into Sodom and Gomorrah. Why is Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed? Same old thing. Nephilim. Finally, the children of Israel going to the Promised Land. Who's there? The giants are there. We were like grasshoppers. The moment I understood, and thank God for Dr. Thomas's book, everything made sense. And then I realized, once I got a hold of the seed war, Genesis 3:15, that we are in a cosmic conflict, which has a beginning and it's going to have an end. And I think we're ramping up to it. But they're here, and they've been around for eons, and their seed is now mingling with the seed of men, but they're not cleaving to it. This is the work of Jim Williamson. They're not cleaving. There's no marriage like there was in the days of Noah, which is why Jesus says this, for a prophecy here. It'll be like the days of Noah when I return. Why would he point to that, for crying out loud?
Right, exactly. That was a horrible time period.
Absolutely. But that's what it's going to be like. And I think that we're in that period of time.
Should we, as human beings, be concerned about what's going on here?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if it's like the days of Noah, if there are hybrids running around, I defer once again to Dr. David Jacobs. And it's happening. I mean, Al Matthews, who we interviewed for our film on UFOs, I mean, Al had an encounter with a woman when she took off those glasses, and she sat on him, and he pushed her away, and the eyes shape-shifted. The eyes shifted into serpentine-type eyes, and she let out a hideous laugh that totally freaked him out, and he ran out of there. He was absolutely freaked out. It was a hybrid. I mean, I had stories, not a lot of them, but people write me these things. They shoot me emails, and then I call them and spend time with them on the phone. Most of them don't want any type of publicity, and that way you know that you've got pay dirt. If somebody wants money or they want fame or fortune or whatever, they want to get paid for the information, that's a whole different deal. But most of the people, I would say over 90% of the people I've ever dealt with don't want anything. And in fact, they want to remain anonymous. They're embarrassed or not. They're still kind of sorting out, well, why did this happen to me type of thing. But I've had people come on the record that have had encounters with hybrid beings. There was a pastor friend of mine, Mike McClung, who had an encounter with one. I think I've told you this before, but he was out for a jog, or like a prayer walk on a beautiful summer day, and in the distance, a very tall, very athletic woman, probably 6'4", 6'5", could be a volleyball player, basketball player, but platinum blonde hair, tied back, and she's running. And as she gets closer, their eyes meet, and she's got blue eyes. Well, the eyes shift into black when she's about 10 feet away. They just go totally black. All the whites are gone. They're just black eyes. And he immediately freaks out, goes into warfare, praying. And as she comes by, she bares her teeth and growls at him. Now, what do you think that was? And he when this happened, he texted me immediately. We talked, and his sign-off was "Welcome to the War." So, this gets into the black-eyed kid stuff with David Weatherly. We covered some of this in our Watchers. Stuff is happening, but the thing that people need to take away without the fear is greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. So as a born-again, spirit-filled Christian, I have the authority, not my authority, but the authority of the Messiah. If I see something like this, I can rebuke first, ask questions later, and that's sort of the motto.
How much of an influence, L.A., is Satan with all of this at this point?
I think all one needs to do is look at the lawlessness in the world and what's going on and realize that the prince of the power of the air is alive and well and doing his thing.
Is he winning?
Well, he wins temporarily. It looks like he's winning, but he's already defeated. He was defeated at the cross. That changed everything. That's we see the Nephilim appear over and over and over and over again. Josephus, first-century Jewish historian, writes about it, and then it all just kind of disappears. When? After the cross, because it's game over. In fact, there's a paper, I remember Dr. Thomas, my mentor, showed me that paper by this theologian called Bullinger, and I also did some more research on Eastern Christianity, Eastern Orthodox, who talk about the same thing. When and it's in the Bible. When Jesus dies on the cross, most people don't know this, but it's there. When he dies on the cross, he goes to the lower parts called Tartarus. It's the lowest part, and there, according to Bullinger, it's a proclamation to the fallen angels.
Now, what do you mean it's the lowest part?
It's the lowest part. In other words, there seems to be compartments, and this is like the gloomiest dungeon, the lowest part.
Is it like hell?
Tartarus. It's like what?
Hell?
Well, it would be like hell, but it would be even darker and the lowest part. It's called Tartarus.
Huh.
And he's there, and it's a proclamation to those angels that sinned on Mount Hermon. They're bound in chains, but that's why it was a suicide mission. They knew what their fate was. They broke the law. Bam, that's the punishment. But they had been told, this is conjecture on my part, they had been told that there's going to be a jailbreak. You're going to get out. It's going to win. We're going to win. We're going to win. And they were promised stuff in the dragon's kingdom. So when the proclamation, when Jesus, he goes there first, George. He goes there first. And it's a proclamation to those angels, those fallen beings that did the unthinkable in the days of Jared on Mount Hermon and started the Nephilim by mingling the seed. He basically says, no jailbreak. You're not getting out. And that's when everything changes. The dragon, Satan, changes his tactics, and this prophecy ties in with Daniel. Their seed will mingle with the seed of men, but there'll be no marriage contract, and that's exactly what we see with the abduction phenomenon. It's exactly what we see.
All right, the Bible talks a lot about the Nephilim. What are the Nephilim?
Well, this is where it goes right off the rails for many people. The Nephilim, in my opinion, and there are people who differ with this, but in my opinion, the Nephilim are the progeny, the offspring of the unholy union between fallen angels, and angel just means messenger. That's what it means. These entities, which are incredibly powerful, that they can manipulate space, time, matter, and energy, but they're it's a very, very depraved state. Something happened. We're not sure exactly what, but what they've done over the centuries, over the millennia, is to cohabit, to take wives, to produce a hybrid offspring known as the Nephilim. So you got fallen angel DNA and the DNA of a human woman. That's what it is. And the biblical account says the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, that they were fair. And they took wives, plural. They took wives, and whomever they chose. And they went into them, and they bore children. And these were the great men of renown. The Nephilim were on the earth. And those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God took wives and had children by them. So it's happened on multiple occasions. There's also, and this is where it's incredibly interesting to me, George, there's a prophecy, there's a prophetic text which says that it'll be like the Son of Man. It'll be like the days of Noah when the Son of Man returns. Like the days of Noah when the Son of Man returns. So what the heck does that mean? And, of course, that points to the days of Noah where the Nephilim first appear. So something is going on, and this is by my research. There's like an overarching theme to it. Yes, the Nephilim, but it ties into the modern UFO phenomena, in my opinion. There's a lot of similarities between the two.
Is it conceivable that the fallen angels that the Bible makes reference to might be some sort of extraterrestrial life?
Well, yes. I mean, anything off planet is by definition extraterrestrial. So these entities do not originate from planet Earth. I mean, there's no doubt about that, in my opinion. But the deal is, could they be interdimensional instead of extraterrestrial? And that's the position I hold to. I think these entities are interdimensional entities. They can pop in, they can pop out, they manipulate space, time, matter, and energy in ways that utterly defy our physics. Now, I get it. Some people will go, well, that's just because it looks like magic to us or they can do this. But wait a second. Just stop for a second. We can't manipulate space, time, matter, and energy, but these entities can. And this is why I really believe that we might be living in some sort of a holographic type universe. In other words, I just heard your report, about the new planet being found in the solar system, and proponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis believe that with all the suns and universes, or not universes, but the suns and solar systems out there, surely there must be life. But then you have Fermi's paradox, which I just love, because Fermi states, I get it, there's a lot of suns out there, but why is everything so silent? Why aren't we hearing anything? And so you've got this paradox. If there are all these places where life could possibly be, why is it that we're not hearing doodly squat basically from anything? Why do these entities come in and do the same thing over and over and over and over again? Abduct people at 3 a.m. in the morning, perform the same sadistic quasi-sexual experimentation or medical examination, whatever, and they've been doing this for decades. As the late Dr. Roger Lear would say, they take the sperm from the men, ovum from the women, and they're doing something. In my opinion, this is where it ties back into the biblical prophetic narrative. They are creating a hybrid being. It's a modern-day Nephilim. And in our free film, which is on YouTube, UFO Disclosure, The Coming Great Deception, The Luciferian Endgame, we sat down with this guy, Al Matthews, and Al had an experience that was absolutely mind-boggling. He had an encounter with what can only be called a hybrid female. And it was bizarre right from the get-go. When he first met this woman, he's a professional mover. She was coming in, had a container coming in from Kuwait, and he saw her for the first time, met her, and she's got these dark wraparound black glasses, almost like swimmer's goggles. So Al figures, well, maybe she's got like an eye problem or something. He doesn't say anything. So they're up on a freight elevator, just this woman and Al Matthews, just the two of them together. And she never met this woman before. She leans forward and she goes, "They're listening, Al." And Al goes, "Who's listening?" And she goes, "The Greys. You and I were supposed to meet. I know you've been taken many times, and so have I." Well, this just blows his mind. It would blow anybody's mind. And so this led to this encounter later on, and this is in the film, by the way, where he gives her his phone number. And in the film, I go, mistake number one. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, she calls him up. And Al goes up, and she's with her friend, and she's still got the dark glasses on. They're drinking wine from these huge goblets. And there's like a deer fly on the side of her glass. And Al goes, "Well, you got the huge fly on your glass." And she goes, "Oh, I'll get it." And she reaches over with her finger. She doesn't grab the fly. The the fly sticks to her finger. And she brings it up to her mouth, and she sucks it in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just looks at Al. And this is the first incident in this little settee between them, which just obviously it's very unnerving, it's disturbing, and Al goes, "Oh my gosh!" Well, she takes off the glasses, and she comes over and she sits on Al's lap. I stop him right there. This is all in the film. I stop him and I go, "Al, is this normal behavior for you? I mean, you have got a girlfriend. Would you allow something like this?" It's like the first time the light bulb goes off because someone is challenging him.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you allow this, Al? And his kind of jaw drops and his lip quivers, and he goes, no, it's because the light bulb goes off. He realizes that, why did I allow this type of thing?
And you're filming it.
And yeah, exactly. And so she leans forward to kiss him. He pushes this woman away, and the eyes shapeshift. They become sort of like reptilian.
Anger, right?
Yeah. And she lets out the most demonic laugh that you've ever heard. He flees the place. He runs for his life. He's terrified. And like an hour later, he's on the phone talking to me. Never met this guy, but we have a mutual contact, mutual friend, Gordy Tong. And so Gordy got me on the phone. We Skyped him. And about 3 weeks later, he gave his life over to the Lord, and the abduction stopped. And I neglected to say that Al had an encounter at a very young age and was a lifelong abductee. And in the film, there's this, it's so unnerving when you hear the story. But Al is driving on a road. He's coming back from work, and he just misses his exit. And I've heard this, I've been researching UFOs since I saw one when I was 12 years old. But I've talked to abductees and people who have encountered stuff and all points of interest. But Al's driving in the car, and he knows he's about to be taken. He knows he's about to be switched off. I remember watching Spielberg's movie Taken, and in that film, there's that whole scene where the guy knows it's about to happen. It's just so unnerving because they know. They know they got about 3, 4, 5 seconds before that's it. They're taken and they're gone. That's exactly what happens to Al. Well, guess what? About 3 hours later, Al wakes up in the car. The car is being let down from the ship. He's bathed in this brilliant white light. His body is shaking, vibrating. Every cell is vibrating. The car touches the road. The car starts, and it drives itself for maybe a minute down this country road.
So the car is dropped down by the UFO, I guess, huh?
Yeah, I mean, that is, when I listen to that, I mean, and I've listened to a lot of stories, it's just unbelievable. So the car is dropped. It's like undulating like a pendulum, swinging back and forth. It hits the ground very softly. It starts by itself, and Al's he's shaking. His body is tingling, shaking. And he watches the car steer itself for a period of time until he kind of comes out. He grabs the wheel. He looks at his watch. 3 hours have gone by, and he has no idea where he is. He finally sees a sign, and he's 2 or 3 hours away from where he was picked up. Now, that's a bizarre story, and the guy that kind of brought it to life, Wesley Sangiorgi, who does our CGI computer-generated imagery, really brought that whole scene to life. But, when you listen to it, it's just it defies, again, it's outside of our normal human experience. I mean, but this is what he lives by. I mean, this is what he experienced. And he tells these stories because he was a lifelong abductee. So, look, in my opinion, these entities have a nefarious agenda. They're not for us. They're against us on some level. And why did they do the same thing over and over and over again?
Well, absolutely. Now, you got 21 films out there, and a good percent deal with the Nephilim, with the series, don't they?
Mm-hmm. We've got 7 of them on the trail of the Nephilim. The house has kind of put the kibosh on doing any type of editing because that's all I do is work on the house and general contractors, and I make the doors and the cabinets and everything else. But number 8 will probably be Lost Civilizations Part 2 or Out of Place Artifacts. The bottom line is this. I say this every day on my daily show, which is on YouTube, On the Trail of a Nephilim, just under L.A. Marzulli, shameless plug. But the bottom line is this. There is a hidden history that has been deliberately obfuscated from the peoples of the world. And people need to wake up. It's all around us, George. My gosh. It's out here on Catalina Island, for crying out loud. I discovered a picture of a 9-foot skeleton. What the heck is that doing there? America's Stonehenge, when you go there, there's a stone called the Baal Stone. It's written in Iberian Punic. No one knew what the thing was. They knew it was writing, but no one could decipher it. It sat in the museum for 11 years. Dr. Barry Feld comes in, looks at the stone, and goes, that looks like Iberian Punic. I think I can translate it. A couple of weeks later, comes back and says, to Baal of the Canaanites in dedication. Well, they went, wow, that's pretty amazing, but they didn't get the Nephilim connection. The Canaanites were a Nephilim tribe. Baal was who they worshipped. And what is that stone doing in New Hampshire, pray tell? But we talked about this in the films. That America Stonehenge is one of the most profound sites I have ever been to because there's a connectivity between America Stonehenge, England, Machu Picchu, Teotihuacan, the Canary Islands, the pyramids that are there, and on and on it goes, including the Great Pyramid of Giza. That's why the second film, we did 2 films on that, but the second film, The Axis Mundi, the Center of the World. George, it's right here in New Hampshire. and it's a 4,000-year-old site based on an 18-and-a-half-year lunar cycle. And that's another thing. All these sites, wherever you go globally, are usually based on an 18-and-a-half-year lunar cycle. And so the archaeologists go, well, they have this information. If you and I go back 4,000, this is the smoking gun. If you and I go back 4,000 years ago, how the heck are we going to track the lunar progression for 18-and-a-half years? We don't even know how long this cycle goes on for. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? 18-and-a-half years? And 2025, we're going to see the lunar standstill at the Octagon Mound in Newark, Ohio, and I'm really going to try to be there for that. The Octagon Mound is this huge earthen octagon. It encompasses about 50 acres of land. Now, when you're there and you're standing in it, you have no idea what this thing is. It's only when you're high above it in the air, we flew the drone up over 1,000 feet, finally you get this, and you see, oh my gosh, it's an octagon, but get this, it's an irregular octagon. All the sides aren't equal, and yet it's absolutely perfectly constructed. So we're looking at advanced geometry, knowledge of an 18-and-a-half-year lunar cycle. Native Americans did not travel in this, and this isn't, slighting them in any way, shape, or form. But when the first settlers came into the region and they looked at them, now, who built this? The Native Americans said, we don't know. It's here when we got here. We hear that same story repeated by the Inca in Peru at places like Sacsayhuaman, where the finest stonework on the planet remains today. So those are just, some high points. But my gosh, George, there's a hidden history, and it's all around us.
Absolutely. What are some of your favorite films, L.A., that you've done?
Oh, but I remember when we went into Dame Isabel Pixick's art studio, and it was an amazing building, high ceilings, about 30 feet in the air, and she was like a world-class muralist. She's also a particle physicist. So you've got this left brain, right brain thing happening, which very few people get.
But both sides are functioning well for her, huh?
Oh, my gosh. It was unbelievable. So we go in there. Rick starts crying because he's just overwhelmed. And I just start laughing. I'm looking around like a little kid. I can't even believe what I'm looking at. She's got this life-size replica of what she believes with the Shroud of Turin. And she was drawn to the Shroud at a very early age. She studied the Shroud, and she was the one that came up with the idea as a particle physicist, but also as an artist. So she looks at the Shroud in a very, very unique way. The Shroud of Turin, for those listeners who don't know what it is a burial cloth that's about 13 feet long, about 3 feet wide. It bears the impression of a man in rigor mortis, in repose, obviously, and bearing the marks of a very horrific scourging and crucifixion.
Right, that some believe could be Jesus Christ.
Well, I mean, that's what my take on it. And Dame Isabel Pixick, who's seen the Shroud up close, there is no painting. In other words, it's not a painting. It's something else. The image that produced on the Shroud is very, very faint. And when Secundo Pia first took the first photograph of it, true story, this is the old photographs with the glass plate. So he's taking a photograph. So this is like 100 years ago. He takes a photograph of the Shroud. He goes into his dark room, and he's holding the glass plate, and he's like with the chemicals and the whole deal. And all of a sudden, this face comes at him, and he almost drops the glass plate. In other words, the image on the Shroud, George, is a negative image. It's a negative image. And so when you take a picture of it, not with a cell phone today, obviously, but back then, you would take a picture, and the image on the glass plate was a negative. And then you take that negative, and you create a positive image. He was blown away. Secundo Pia was absolutely blown away. So you get this image on the Shroud of a crucified man, and Dame Isabel Pixick said, this is not a painting. What she believes happened, and I agree with her, again, she's looking at this from the perspective of a particle physicist, which is just unbelievable, and I don't pretend to understand that. She said that body was levitated in the tomb. Space-time as we know it stopped. The body's levitated. The Shroud is then drawn tight around the body. In other words, because you have a dorsal image and a frontal image on the Shroud. How is that possible? How is it possible? So because the Shroud was over the body, you have a frontal image, but you also have a dorsal image. And the image is, again, very, very faint. You can only see it, really, when you photograph the Shroud. The scourge marks are unbelievable. But she believes the body was levitated in the tomb. The cloth was then pulled tight above the body and below the body. So the body is suspended in the air. Time, space, as we know it, completely stops. The body literally disintegrates, or let's say transmogrifies,
right,
but with millions of particles of light And that's what, in her opinion, creates the image on the shroud. And I concur.
It was all energy. It was a burst of energy. The Bible, of course, says that Christ resurrected, and it could have been that burst that did that.
I agree. It definitely was a burst. And, of course, our friends who believe in E.T. and everything else will spin that back into saying that somehow E.T. had a hand in it. I would say absolutely not. But, that's where we completely disagree. Bottom line is this. The Shroud was interviewing Dame Isabel Pixick, and, of course, Barry Schwartz, same thing. That was in our Shroud segment. So we interviewed Dame Isabel Pixick, and we also interviewed Barry Schwartz, who was the STIRP, Shroud of Turin Research Project photographer, and he was up out of 120 hours they were allowed to look at the Shroud. Barry was up for 110 hours. He took thousands and thousands of photographs. I've been to his house, and in his bedroom, he's got the headshot of the Shroud hanging up in his bedroom. So something else is going on there, and it's pretty amazing. But, Barry speaks with great erudition and talks about the image on the Shroud of the crucified man. So that was one of my high points in the entire Watchers series. But, there's so many of them, like when we were in Stock Stable Mom for the first time, and we're filming, and Richard's about 50 yards away with a very long lens, and I've got a wireless mic on. I'm standing in front of this huge megalithic wall. Some of the stones weigh 80, 90, 100 tons. It's just unbelievable. No mortar, polygonal shapes. Lots of people have talked about this. But when you're actually there for the first time, it's mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. And as Richard started filming, he gave me the start. All of a sudden, there's this thunderclap that happens just when I begin the introduction, and I kind of look at him, and he looks at me, and we just kind of start giggling. It was just like you couldn't have scripted it better. It was unbelievable. But Saxia with Mom is certainly right up there in the Watchers series. It was very just mind-boggling, and I've been there. I've been back to the site like 2 or 3 times, 3 times actually, and it's just every time I'm there, it's just if I'm leading a tour, I'll have the people. I'll go, touch the rocks with your hands. You're allowed to do that. Touch the rock. You are touching the fingerprints of the supernatural, in my opinion. The Inca did not make this, and we'd have a lot of trouble making it in modernity with cranes and diamond saws and lasers and the whole 9 yards. A whole different thing. We're looking at a technology that we don't possess today. So, and whoever did it took the technology with them.
It's so amazing, L.A., what we've been doing and what has been happening, what we don't know.
It's just like the Smithsonian. What do they have? Why? I say this on my daily show almost, constantly. It's like, why can't we look at what's there? Why is it all tucked away? Why is it hidden? It's like the Dead Sea Scrolls when they found them. Finally, they did a raid, and they just went in and took pictures of everything because they had the Dead Sea Scrolls for, 40, 50 years and wasn't publishing anything? People absolutely had it. And then Biblical Archaeological Review did this like sort of a Ninja Turtles thing. They went in and photographed everything and then just disseminated the photographs, and other scholars got to look at what was there and did the translations. It's like, what are you guys doing? Why are you holding this back from the public? Why can't we see what the Smithsonian has? Why? We know that giants roam the land. Native Americans tells us about this. We know from the reports from the early settlers, 8, 9, 10, 12-foot skeletons found. Don't tell me that doctors didn't know how to measure 120, 130, 40, 50 years ago. They knew how to measure. They were skilled in anatomy. They know what a giant looks like. But everything is like cloaked, and the spin is there, and it's obfuscated, and it's in some cases outright lies. Look, when we were out in Catalina Island, I discovered the photograph of a 9-foot giant out there. We had it analyzed by 3 different people. So I published that in my book, On the Trail of the Nephilim, and Richard and I went back about 6 months after the book was published. Well, there's the photograph on the wall, except it's blown up. The little 5x7 black and white that I photographed, right? We had to analyze, and there was a 9-footer. 3 different guys looked at the photograph, digitized it, analyzed it. There was no collision between them. They all placed the skeleton a little bit above 9 feet. That rewrites history as we know it. There's a giant out there. We also found 6 fingers. But we go back to the museum, and in it, there's the photograph, but guess what? The giant is cropped out of the picture. And the new curator, because the old curator got fired, that's another story. But I asked the new curator, I said, well, why did they do this? And she goes, I don't know. They just handed me this picture and told me what to do. There is a managed agenda. There's a controlled narrative which deliberately obfuscates the truth. And the people of the world, we have a right to know our origins. We have a right to know the real history of the world. And I think part of the pushback is that my work certainly points to a supernatural worldview. And the prevailing worldview in both academia and the scientific community is that of the Darwinian paradigm, where there is no supernatural, there is no God, there are no miracles, there's no right or wrong, no ultimate good or evil, nothing like that. Everything just evolved over billions of years. But the neo-Darwinists are looking at something called panspermia. They believe that perhaps we were seeded here by, guess what, drumroll please, an advanced race of extraterrestrials. So the whole thing circles back once again back to E.T. Were we created by a loving, holy God, or was all this some sort of a seeding by an advanced race of extraterrestrials? And there's the tension.
L.A., even if we were part of the Darwinian theory, even if we were, it doesn't explain the complexity of how it all started, and that alone is the wonderment of all this, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I remember the last conference I spoke at before COVID hit and all that nonsense. I would look at the audience and I say, if we are intellectually honest, no one knows where we are or what this is. If the universe is analogous to the United States of America, is planet Earth in Dallas, Los Angeles, New York, we have no idea. We have no flipping idea what this is, how it got here, or what we're doing here. Where does consciousness reside? No one knows where is George now? You're in your body, I get that. You're in your little three-dimensional biological bodysuit just like I am. We can talk, we can hear, we can reason, we can think, but I'm not this. I'm in a shell. So where does my consciousness reside? No one knows. Nobody has a clue as to where consciousness actually resides. It's not this little guy in the brain. Is it in the blood? No one knows. We only know that when a person dies, the body is still here, but they go someplace. That spirit, that soul, travels to someplace else.
Absolutely.